Everybody, good morning. Welcome to the Belong Power of Sport Toolkit launch. I'm Sundar Katwala. I'm from the charity and think tank British Future. Like many of you, British Future is a member of the Belong network. Those of you who aren't can find out from Jo how to change that. It's one of the actions for today, and Jo will be telling you more about the Belong network when she presents the toolkit. Now, I'm not Professor Ted Cantle, who has done a lot of work on this toolkit with many of the other practitioners and partners, but wasn't able to be here. So I've been substituted in as an impact substitute, I hope, to get this thing going. Please tweet about today's event using the hashtag Power of Sport, and we are recording this event and we'll upload the webinar to Belong's website. The chat function, you can say who you are, give messages to the organisers. If you've got a question for the panel after the presentations, it's the Q&A function, so direct your things. I think those are the main housekeeping points. Now, the power of sport is a very timely topic. We've talked a lot about the power of sport this year in society, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. We've had major national debates about sport, cohesion, identity and race in football this summer, in cricket this autumn, and we will be having more of those debates over the next year. We've got many major events ahead of us. We're hosting in this country a Women's European Football Championship, the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham. There's a Football World Cup at Christmas, oddly enough, next year out in Qatar. But all of those will be moments when the national conversation is again about sport, but all of the time at a local level. The power of sport is being deployed to hopefully connect people from different backgrounds together and build more cohesive communities if we get it right. And today's toolkit is advice for all of you working in inclusion, generally in community sports, in physical activity programs. So often one of the first opportunities, one of the great interests of many young people, one of the first opportunities to build those connections that are the foundations for cohesive communities. So very topical, lots of people talking about it. Belong and their partners have been working away on this for months and years before the subject hit the headlines. And Spirit of 2012 and Sport England have supported this toolkit, and lots of the people in the room, on the panel, in the audience have been involved. And Street Games, the Sport for Development Coalition, Sporting England, the Youth Sport Trust, Sport Education, London Sport, EFL Trust, the Department of Levelling Up, DCMS, Manchester City Council, the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, they've all contributed, as you'll see if you go onto this toolkit, with their expertise, their experience, their support, and many of you will be adding to that. So we'll hear about the toolkit, what it's for, and how to do it, and we'll have an outline to that. But before that, the most exciting thing that's going to happen for me this morning is I am getting to introduce one of the great legends of sport and the power of sport, Brendan Batson, who played for Cambridge, played for Arsenal, was legendary at West Brom. They've put up statues to Brendan and the other 3 degrees at West Bromwich these days. I've often said that it was the Commission for Racial Equality probably did a lot for race equality in this country over the decades, but I think West Bromwich Albion in Brendan's era might have done just that little bit more. And since then, Brendan has had as long a career, probably a longer career, as a sports administrator with the PFA, with West Brom, with Sporting Equals. He's currently the chairman of the Professional Players Federation, who've continued to pick up medals and gongs, Brendan, MBEs and OBEs and so on. It's great to have you here, and do please tell us about the power of sport and why the theme of today matters to you.
Well, good morning, all. Good morning, Sundar. Thank you very much for that introduction. Yes, I think I am a good example of how sport brings people, from different backgrounds together. I came I was born in Grenada, grew up in Trinidad as well, came to England in '62, never having seen football. But football, I got introduced to football by my school friend. I was 9 years old, a school friend of mine called Dennis Sheridan, and he introduced me to football. Never seen it, therefore never played it. And it was football that really got me connected as a new kid on the block to those other boys at that school. I went to a Catholic school in Tilbury. I came up with my brother, lived with my uncle and aunt, and we were the only black family that I knew of in Tilbury. So I was a new kid on the block, And football, along with, to a lesser degree, athletics, was what really got me connected with those lads who became my friends. It was a difficult period to start with, coming into this cold country called England. But very soon, because of sport, I got really accepted at a small degree of talent at that time, which I developed over the years. But I think it was my involvement, my connection with that sport, particularly football, that really got me involved with a group of lads who became my friends. And I moved after a couple of years to Walthamstow. I was playing a lot of football then, got picked up by a football team, again got involved in that. And I think it was the power of sport and those who want to be involved in it that really paved the way for me to be involved in sport all my life as a schoolboy and all my life as a career. And I think the Power of Sport Toolkit, to which Sunda's referred to, is something that would be attractive to all who want to be involved in some way, whether it be as participants, whether it be as organizers, in whatever capacity. I think the Power of Sport Toolkit would be very beneficial to all those who want to be involved in sport. And I can say from a personal experience, for all my life, sport has been the best thing that's ever happened to me. It's endured with me throughout my schoolboy and adult life, and I don't know what I would do without it.
Brendan, thank you very much for that introduction to the power of sport, your experience, and why it matters for you. And thank you for everything you've continued to do after your playing career to make that happen for others. We're going to hear about this toolkit now, and we're going to hear from Belong. Kaya Davis-Hayon and Joe Broadwood are going to introduce the toolkit, tell you what it is and how you can do it. The power of sport, we can get it right or we can get it wrong. Hopefully this is a key example of how to get it right. Over to you, Belong.
Thanks so much, Sunda, and deep appreciation to you for chairing and to Brendan for speaking at this event. I'm just going to talk a little bit about Belong and what we do, and then I'm going to hand over to Kaya to take us through the toolkit. Just a little bit about Belong. We're Belong, the Cohesion Integration Network. We're a charity and a membership organisation, and our vision is a more integrated and less divided British society. We're working with all of our members for a fairer, more inclusive, kinder, cohesive British society. What we do is we connect, support and mobilise people and organisations across different sectors. So we work with business, with public sector, with civil society organisations, with academics, and across neighbourhoods in the UK to improve the practice and policy of integration and cohesion. So just to give you some examples of some of our recent projects, this year, I'm already in 2022. This year we've been working with some of the delivery organisations who were running programmes under the government's race, faith and hate crime to examine their collective learning and shared impact and to help disseminate some of their results. We carry out research to support evidence-based practice. We've been running a huge research study, Beyond Us and Them, over the last 18 months to study the impact of COVID on societal cohesion in partnership with the University of Kent and funded by the Nuffield Foundation. And it's produced some really positive evidence of the benefits of investing in social cohesion at a place-based level. And we generally work with our members to support initiatives and programmes in local areas and together advocate for the importance of social cohesion work, because what we think is that social cohesion is often only noticed by its absence. We only notice it when social cohesion isn't there in communities. But it's a bit like gardening. You know, if you don't pay attention to your garden, if you don't pay attention to social cohesion, then like your garden, it becomes a wild weed infested mess. Social cohesion can break down and cause problems at a local level. So it needs to be attended to and maintained over time. So the idea for this toolkit was actually in the ether when I joined Belong back in 2019. And Sunda's already mentioned Professor Ted Cantle, and he's been a real driving force behind this toolkit. He was really passionate about the need for something which really helped people understand how sport could be used, not just in terms of all the many benefits it brings, but as a power for social good, to sort of work with tensions in communities and to support bridging between groups and communities at a local level. Because one of the things that we know is that when people from different backgrounds get to know each other, it's one of the most powerful ways of breaking down prejudice and promoting empathy between groups. So Ted had an awful lot to do in terms of actually initiating and developing the ideas for this toolkit. And then we've been supported by a range of really brilliant partners, both Sport England and Spirit of 2012, who are on the panel, and Sunda's already talked through the members of our advisory group who've given us support along every step of the way. So I'm going to share my screen now and hand over to Kaya, who is going to take us through the toolkit in more detail.
Thank you, Jo. And I'm actually just going to turn my camera off to make sure that my internet doesn't kind of jump at all. So thanks very much. So if you could move to the fourth slide, Jo, that would be great. So I'm going to talk today about the Power of Sport Toolkit, but I'm also going to talk a bit about social cohesion, expanding on what Jo has said and about the role of sport in supporting better social cohesion in local areas. So if you could move across a couple of slides, Jo, that would be great. That's perfect, thank you. So I thought it would be useful to just start off by talking about the term social cohesion and what we understand by this term. So Jo's just kind of outlined a little bit of our thinking around the term social cohesion at the Belong Network, but I'm just going to expand a bit on that. So at Belong, we view social cohesion as the glue that binds us together, and as Jo said, as something that is often much more noticeable via its absence rather than its presence. So social cohesion is definitely about tackling prejudice and racism, but it's also about much more than that. So social cohesion is about the trust that we have in each other and in the institutions that govern us. It's about how connected we feel with the places in which we live and we work. And it's about the depth, breadth, and strength of our bonds with each other. So socially cohesive places feel warm and they feel welcoming and they feel like good places to live, work, learn, and grow old in. So places where people feel accepted. Social cohesion is something that impacts everybody, everywhere, and it's also something that everybody can contribute to building. Could you move to the next slide, please, Jo? So at Belong, we believe firmly that sport can play a really powerful role in bringing people together and creating strong social bonds and trust between individuals and groups. And whilst structural inequalities absolutely do still exist in sport, and as Sunda has outlined, we've seen this unfold in a very real way in some sports this year, we do feel that at its best, sport has a unique power to bring us together in shared experiences that help break down barriers and challenge ingrained prejudices. And I think Brendan just gave us a lovely example of how sport made him feel very welcomed when he was younger. So we know that sports programs are already playing a key role in inclusion and in strengthening cohesion in local areas. We also know that sports practitioners and sports organisations are often very keen to address cohesion, but that they might have limited formal experience of how they could design their sports programs to ensure that they're bringing people together in a way that supports long-lasting cohesion. And so with this in mind, we really wanted to create a useful resource that, as Jo has said, wouldn't just help practitioners and funders design sports programs that might help bring people together, but would also allow them to effectively measure and evaluate those programs and showcase the work they're doing and also learn from the work that's being done. And so in 2019, we were funded by Spirit of 2012 to produce this guidance document. And this guidance document aimed to do just that, so to help people design and evaluate sports programs focused on social cohesion. we worked with Ralph Scott at the Good Faith Partnership to produce a comprehensive piece of work that draws on the latest academic research and brings together the experience of researchers, academics, and sports and physical activity practitioners to outline how to design sports programs that can bridge divides and help build greater social cohesion. Could you move on to the next slide, please, Jo? We've since received additional funding from Sport England to turn this guidance document into an easy to use, accessible online toolkit. And this is what we're going to be talking about in a bit more detail today. So the original guidance document contains lots of really in-depth academic research. And what we wanted to do was repackage all of that valuable information into an online toolkit that is visually appealing, easy to navigate and accessible, but still remains educational and informative. So we created an online learning platform with the support of our designers Yoke that supports those designing and evaluating sports programs working towards better cohesion outcomes. And this toolkit is filled with information, with resources, with best practice examples, with practical tools, activities, templates, and much, much more. And I'm going to talk about some of the functionality today, but I do urge you to log into the toolkit and have an explore, because it's a really rich source of information about sport and cohesion. Could you move on to the next slide, please, Jo? So the toolkit is easy to use and interactive, and it takes the user on a journey that helps them to understand their specific local context and some of the cohesion and integration challenges and opportunities within that context. It helps you to understand how to embed social cohesion into the design of your sports program, so how to think about social cohesion from the very outset, how to monitor the delivery of your program's social cohesion outputs, how to evaluate the impact your program has had on supporting better cohesion and integration, and how to learn from your evaluation. So let's take a look at the toolkit in a bit more detail and at some of the unique ways in which it equips sports organisations and sports practitioners with tools and resources that will help maximise the really positive impact that sport can have on social cohesion. So if you could move to the next slide, please, Jo. So the tool offers a unique step-by-step guide to embedding inclusion and cohesion into sports and physical activity programs. So it starts with a really short, snappy taster quiz that asks you 10 key questions. And I think my colleague Alex is going to just post a link to the quiz in the chat function, so you can have a little look at that if you'd like. So the questions in this quiz help you to understand how much you know about cohesion and integration in your area. And they also help you to gauge how much you've thought about the role that your sports program or activity might play in building better bridges between individuals and groups. Once you've completed that quiz, you'll be taken into the toolkit itself. And in the first couple of steps, you can see on the slide your area and your sports program. You'll be guided through a process that helps you think in a really active and engaged way about cohesion in your area and about how your sports program can develop better cohesion. I'm going to come back to talk in a little bit more detail about your area in just a second, but I just want to talk about some of the other stages. So some of the other steps focus on things like barriers. So they talk about the barriers that could lead to unequal participation in sport, and also to some of the ways that these barriers might be equalised to enable everybody to participate on an equal footing. So an example of a barrier in the tool is related to how individuals perceive organisations. So from the outside, a sports programme or provider could promote a sense of exclusivity that makes new participants feel unwelcome, or like that sport or that programme isn't for them. And at its most extreme, this can take the form of prejudice, and this can really discourage certain groups and individuals from participating. A way of equalising this particular barrier is ensuring that from start to finish, sports programs are inclusive and aware of diverse needs. So that means a zero tolerance approach to racism and other forms of exclusionary prejudice, And it also means creating an environment where everybody feels welcomed and confident participating. Other steps in the tool focus on evaluating cohesion and integration outcomes, and also include things like templates and survey questions that help to do this. And at each stage in the tool, answers are emailed to you so that you're essentially developing your program and design and evaluation as you complete this tool. So the second kind of key feature of this tool is its place-based approach. So at Belong, we believe strongly that place really matters, and that different strategies to address social cohesion are going to be needed in different places. And because of this, the first step of the tool focuses on your area and how to understand your area. It includes things like how you find out information about the demographic breakdown of your area, how you learn more about the different statutory, community, voluntary and faith organisations operating in your area, and how you might think about the cohesion challenges, but also the cohesion opportunities in your area. So what I want to show you now is a short video of Zara Niazi from Bradford Council and Mudassir Shah from Blackburn with Darwin Council talking about demographic data. So the tool has lots of different forms of content, and one of the forms of content is video content about kind of key concepts within the tool. So I'll ask Joe to just press play, please, on the video. Joe, could you unmute? I can't hear the video.
Like more national tools that you can use. For example, we use something called Local Insight, which I absolutely love because you can really tailor and hone in into not just a ward, but you can actually hone into a neighbourhood or even a street. And I think that level of granular information you get is actually really, really useful intelligence, because that gives you a lot of information about what's happening within a space, and you can define what you mean by community and define what you mean by area. And I think that's what's so interesting about that. It also maps things like your local amenities, schools, libraries, and I think you can really use it. I mean, local authorities can use Local Insight in a much more intelligent way, basically. And I think that's really important, that when you get any kind of stats, what are the stats telling you? What is the data telling you, and how can you proactively use it? So really, really having a good play of the system, a really good play of data, and looking at it in different ways as well, in terms of how you layer data up. For example, multiple deprivation areas, health data, and you can find some really interesting trends, and it triggers some really interesting thoughts about how you might go and deliver something. So I think, yeah, a Local Insight for us is definitely something that we use quite proactively.
I mean, the council website is a great place to go to. However, the kind of data is still the 2011 census. For me, what I would say is go outside yourselves, go and take a walk, go and take a drive. Think, if you're picking your children up, who's around. When you're going out to the supermarket shopping, have a look around as who's there as well. At the same time, think, listen, and kind of see what languages are being spoken as well. I think that's the best way to find out who is in that area. Sadly, we hear those terms, don't we? Oh, it's predominantly the Asian area, or where all the white people live. But actually, when you look beyond that, you would possibly see it could be someone, although the skin colour is, the white, the class is white, but they're speaking Polish or Romanian. So diverse, along with those from an Asian area, Indian, Gujarati, Punjabi, could be our migrants that have come from Italy and Spain, who really feel as though they don't fit in anywhere. And so it's really interesting to kind of just be able to go outside and really just explore with your own eyes and ears and see who's in the area, which then should give you some food for thought as to what is taking place in the local area as well. There's always a local councillor who's around to kind of give you a helping hand, a local group you could think about. I mean, kind of coming through to ourselves at the integration team, we would be happy to be able to kind of put residents along with groups
Thanks, Joe. So we have a few videos like that in the tool where we have specialists talking about key concepts like barriers, like evaluation, like demographic data. If you could move on to the next slide, please, Joe. So the third thing that I want to talk about is the kind of evidence base on which the tool is built. So the tool is based on evidence-based academic research and a developed theory of change process that helps users identify barriers, equalizers, and conditions, and that helps them understand how to measure outputs and cohesion and integration outcomes. So if you could move to the next slide, please, Joe. So the research phase of this project was conducted by our academic researcher, Ralph Scott, and it included a kind of rapid review of the academic evidence on sport, a review of practice, looking in particular at evidence from studies on the impact of sport for cohesion programs, research into existing approaches to measurement, behaviour change, and best practice evaluation, and then 3 workshops with sports and integration practitioners and 8 feedback conversations with practitioner evaluation and academic experts. So it really sought to kind of bring together an evidence-based academic research perspective with practitioner perspectives. If you could move on to the next slide, please, Joe. And the academic research was really critical in helping us to understand the need for this tool, but also how to frame the content in a way that is academically rigorous, but is also easy to use and accessible. And the second half of the tool in particular draws on academic research to help the user think about how to evaluate their project using short and long-term outcomes and indicators that are linked to nationally available measures and data sets. So there are lots of templates and downloads that you can download that include these outcomes and outputs. And then finally, I just want to talk about the collaborative process for developing this tool. So the tool hasn't been developed overnight. It's been a long process. It's taken us 2 years to produce, and that's because it's been developed through a really collaborative and iterative process with repeated consultation with sports practitioners, delivery organisations, commissioners, funders of programmes, and with academic input from researchers as well. We've been extremely grateful for the support and endorsement of our excellent advisory panel, which includes the members of our panel discussion today, and then also representatives from, and I know Sundar's already outlined these, but I'd like to thank them again, Youth Sport Trust, Sport Education, London Sport, EFL Trust, DLUHC, DCMS, Manchester City Council, and the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham. We're really, really grateful to our advisory panel for their support with this tool and for their expert guidance throughout this process. So now that I've outlined some of the background to the tool and some of its key features, I want to hand back over to Joe, who's going to talk a bit about next steps.
So thanks very much, Kaya. So next steps, well, we really encourage you to go and visit the toolkit. You can go to our website and follow the link on the landing page. It's live now. We're very excited by it, and we'd love to get your feedback and your thoughts on it, because I think, like all online toolkits, it's going to need further development as we go forward, and we want to obviously make sure it's up to date and that it's kind of working with what's happening on the ground with sports delivery organisations. We are planning next year to launch a Belong, Sport and Cohesion community of practice, because we don't want the work of the toolkit to stay online. We think that the best way that this toolkit can be utilised is for it actually to be embedded in practice. So next year we're launching a Sport and Cohesion community of practice. 3 of Belong's founder members are sports organisations, Sporting Equals, Youth Sport Trust, and Street Games, and we're working with them to convene a Sport and Cohesion community of practice. So please do sign up to our mailing list. I think Alex is going to post the link in the chat to find out more about that, and look out for further announcements by following us on Belong Network or on Twitter or via LinkedIn. And I think what we're also thinking about with our members and our sort of wider stakeholders is how we can do more to really embed some of these key principles around social cohesion into community sports and physical activity. I think we're going to open it up to the panel now, so I'm going to stop sharing and hand back over to Sunda.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Kai. Now, what we're going to have next is a whistle-stop tour of expert perspectives for a couple of minutes each before we get your questions, which we're keen to hear in the Q&A function. Please let me just tell you about the 5 speakers we'll hear briefly from, all engaged in this issue from different perspectives. Ruth Hollis, the Chief Executive of Spirit of 2012, because of Spirit of 2012's roots in being founded out of the London 2012 National Lottery Community Fund. They've been very interested in how these big events can also deliver sustained change over time. We'll hear from Vivienne Taylor, who has got the vitally important job right now of leading on equality, diversity and inclusion for Sport England, where she draws on a wealth of experience across sectors in local government, in charities, civic society and sport. We'll hear from Ollie Dudfield, who's the Executive Director of the Sport for Development Coalition, and he's got prior experience leading sport work for the Commonwealth Secretariat, so right across development and peace across, you know, the varied 54 countries of the Commonwealth, who will gather, of course, in Birmingham next year. Hannah Crane is a senior leader at Street Games, Director of People and Partnerships there. And Street Games, as we'll hear, you know, very strong focus in the power of sport for youth development and well-being and health. And we'll hear from Shaheen Bai, who is a project leader, research leader for Sporting Equals, working there for over a decade on how sport can catalyse the kinds of change that we're all talking about wanting to see. So Ruth, if I could ask you to kick off, please.
Thank you very much, Sunda, and thank you for inviting to the Belong Network, for inviting Spirit of 2012 today. We're really proud of the support we've given to Belong to develop the guidance that underpins this important and timely toolkit. I'm very pleased to be able to support the development of the toolkit alongside Sport England and others, and it's just brilliant to see it come to life. So huge congratulations to Joe and Kaya and to the whole Belong team. We've already heard compelling evidence from Brenda, Sunda and Kaya about why this toolkit is so vital, and particularly so vital now. So I'm not going to repeat that, but I think a really key question for all of us in this room following from that is what we need to do now to bring people of different backgrounds together. And like Belong, Spirit of 2012 believes that grassroots sport has an important role to play in this respect, but it needs to be done in an intentional and purposeful way. We know that integration and cohesion doesn't happen by happy accident and just putting people in a room together. Joe talked very much about the power of bringing people together. And we know that as well as being fun, sport can involve bridging social contact between us and them, and that this social contact can reduce stereotypes that lead towards prejudice and racism. But we also know, and we've seen recently, that while sport can bring people of different backgrounds together, this doesn't always happen. And racism is still far too prevalent in sport, as the treatment of Azim Rafiq shows. And racism needs to be addressed if sport is to successfully bring people together to address cohesion and integration. Sunda mentioned in his opening remarks that 2022 offers a significant opportunity to supercharge this. We've got the Commonwealth Games, the football, the Rugby League World Cups and the Women's Euros. So it's a real opportunity for us to work together to develop an inclusive and more common identities through sports participation. There are just 2 aspects of the toolkit that I want to highlight, which from a funder perspective, I think really shows how grassroots sport can encourage social contact. Firstly, the importance, and Kaya took us through this, of understanding the place your project will operate in and the experience and context of the people that you want to impact, which I think is really vitally important for building projects that don't just provide fun activities, but also make a genuine difference to cohesion and integration. And secondly, we're really pleased to see the emphasis on monitoring and evaluation, not as a tool to tell a funder how brilliant your project has been at the end, which we see quite often still, but to help you really maximise the impact of your project for the people and the communities you're working with whilst the project is running. So understanding what those people need that are coming to your project, understanding who isn't in the room in your project as much as who is, and being able to take action to address that when you've still got time to bring people into the project. As a funder of social outcomes at Spirit, we're really pleased with the toolkit, and we believe it will help us and others fund more impactful social cohesion projects through sport and perhaps other mechanisms, because it would be interesting to see this applied through arts and volunteering, and help build the capacity of organisations that use it. So thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. As Ruth has said there, it's a moment of challenge, it's a moment of opportunity. I think today's about how you take a watershed moment and do something practical and sustained with it. So Vivienne Taylor, leading for Sport England on equality, diversity and inclusion, it'd be great to see how you see this moment of challenge and opportunity.
Thank you, Sunda, and I'm delighted to be here. For me, I think the starting point for all of this is, you know, we started this whole thing in a room in February 2019 when we got together some members of sectors of the sports world to talk about community cohesion and sport. And there was a lone voice in the room. I hope you didn't feel too alone, Joe, but I think at the time you said toolkit very quietly at the back of the room, and we all heard it, but we didn't really realise how far this would go and how far it would progress over the time. And our last meeting as a group in terms of the Sport and Community Cohesion Working Group was in December 2019, just before the world changed and turned into a strange and frightening place. But what it did do is really highlight the value of the work that the toolkit is able to promote and support. And what's been happening in the background is that you've continued the work, you've kept going, and the working group have continued to meet even when we've been working through a global pandemic. So, you know, we've heard and continue to hear about the power of sport, and when we're thinking about the significant events that have all been mentioned, the Olympics, Paralympics, World Championships, Grand Prix, all of the winter sports, World Cups, the local and grassroots events as well. For a small moment, we all get to feel the magic and the power when there's a success, when there's a medal won, when someone's achieved something great or broken a record. It's for that moment we all feel it, whether we're there or not. And for me, it's the outcomes and the positive difference that sport and physical activity programs make. And I think it's really important that we understand, all those that are trying to develop programs around cohesion, around integration, around bringing communities together, that you really truly understand what it is you're doing before you start that process. And the toolkit really enables this, and taking you through key necessary steps to ensure that what projects you propose to do from conception actually work out in practice. And I can't stand on any virtual platform without speaking about our strategy, Uniting the Movement. And at the centre of that, our strategy is tackling inequalities. It's the work, it's what we're going to do for the next 9 years. And bearing in mind that we're coming up to 1 year of our strategy launch, the next 9 years are going to be key to everything that we do and the implementation of that. So to begin to make the change in communities and places where people engage and take part in sport and physical activity, I'd encourage anyone who's thinking about using sport to use the toolkit, to consider what you're doing and why you're doing it. It's a practical, and it takes you the sensible steps around the approach to creating a program that can really help with levelling up the agenda, the levelling up agenda. And the impact of sport is the catalyst for what happens next in people's lives. And hopefully, you know, we can move to more positive, inspiring and motivational times with sport, and we know they exist. So at the most, in terms of the most you can do is start that whole process, start the movement of change in community cohesion, use the toolkit, use and join any of the forums that the Belong are promoting, because they generally are about committing ourselves and challenging ourselves in our own places to make the change we want to see.
Thank you. Vivienne, I'm going to hand over to Ollie Dudfield of the Sport for Development Coalition. He's been a member of the steering group. Ollie, tell us what you would like to see happen now and happen next.
Thanks, Sunda. There's probably two words that really come to mind they both start with I, and sometimes I've said this before and said double I, and people thought I'm talking about a battery that you can't find, but no. The I's are the intentionality and iterative approaches or iteration. And I think these two principles are quite central to the toolkit and why it then provides such a valuable resource. Now, talk about intentionality. If we consider the power of sport, perhaps something more like a quite all-encompassing, but a significant moldable lump of clay or plasticine or what have you, and it can be stretched and molded to have a very positive impact, or it can have some potential less positive impacts. And so that intentionality of how we understand place, the issues in a place, the assets in a place, the intentionality around the design of the sport-based programs, understand what skills and competencies that the people who are going to support and deliver the programs require is absolutely key. As that intentionality that brings together the various members of the broader Sport for Development coalition around using sport very intentionally, and the toolkit, certainly in terms of social cohesion, provides a very good basis and resource to support that intentionality of design. And then the second I is the iterative approach, and the cyclical nature of, again, understanding the real assets that are in the communities in which programs, sport-based approaches are embedded, then utilising those assets as well as some of the dynamics of the place to really look at that design of programs, designs of interventions, monitor and evaluate the implementation, and really reflect on the learning from that program implementation, from what is learned from and within the communities where sport is being used as one asset to support social cohesion, and then replan and start the cycle again. And there's a significant, again, resources, tools, and evidence-based process to really support that iterative approaches to use sport and mold that plasticine or that clay to have a positive impact in communities. So in response to your question, and where I see the real value of this resource and value of the toolkit is very much it can support the intentionality that's required in terms of harnessing the positive assets that sport can bring in communities across the UK. And secondly, really supports those community leaders, those community groups to take an iterative approach to how they're using sport as a tool to support social cohesion.
Thank you, Ollie. I think that's important. Intentionality, iterative. It's a learning process, and this is part of the learning. This toolkit, but that should go on. I think this question of intentionality is going to be very interesting in the discussion, because intentionality of what, or for what? Cohesion, integration, diversity. These are similar words, but they're different words, and I think that's going to be an interesting point. Let's hear from Hannah Crane. Street games being a power in this field. Hannah, tell us how you see the future.
Hi, Sunda. Thank you very much. And as everyone has said, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. We've been very privileged to be involved in the development of this toolkit, and it is hopefully the beginning of something new. And in particular, I think what's important from our perspective when we sit at a table like this is to represent those community organisations who are out there and doing this work, and who know and understand their communities really well. The clip in the video about looking about when you pop to the supermarket and seeing who's living in your area, it speaks really to how we work and how our community organisations work. What this toolkit, I hope, allows them to do in the future that has been harder is to work with really clear definitions I think that's one of the simple things that this toolkit really does lay down a line for, so that those community groups who are doing the work are using similar language, because actually there are many terms out there, and how we use them and what we mean by them is crucial, both in creating consistency of evidence, but also in communicating to funders and potential commissioners. And that's again one of the things I think this toolkit will allow us to do better than we necessarily have done in the past. When I've been through it, I think the information around barriers and equalisers we will certainly use to share with funding partners and commissioners, possibly who haven't got a sporting background and don't understand that context of how sport has the power to have impacts in these areas. So this for us is a toolkit that does many things, but communication and clarity of purpose with that intention, as you've mentioned, is really crucial. So that for us is the beginning, I think, of hopefully a clearer future. We certainly are really keen that this toolkit gets used. I was really pleased to hear Joe reiterate the conversations that we've had away from today about it not just being an online tool. The organisations that we work with are experts in their areas and have lots to learn and to share with each other. And so how we continue to do that work from here on will be incredibly important. I really liked the your area section of the toolkit. The community organisations we support do know their areas, they do know their audiences, but actually are always looking to expand, always looking to understand more. And I thought the bits in there around demographics, of understanding the breadth of where you could be working and who you could be working with, and how to think about community cohesion and how to think about the factors that you need to plan for in order to achieve that intentionality that Ollie was just describing, will really help especially smaller community organisations who maybe community cohesion isn't job number one. You know, they might be looking to make the area that they're working in a bit safer. They might be looking to target mental well-being in their participants. But actually, community cohesion could be an intentional outcome. And this toolkit will help them understand how to do that, how to plan for it, and then how to prove it. And how we prove it, I think, is so key to what we do in the future. Thank you, Cinder.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I'm next going to introduce Shaheen Bai. Can I just before I do that, just want to praise the panelists who, you know, on this whistle-stop tour are being very good at keeping to time, which is great because we get to answer your questions for half an hour. If they do that, all we then need is your questions in the Q&A function for them to be answered. So do rustle some up for us, please. Shaheen Bai, you're you know, with your long track record in Sporting Equals, like many other people who are practitioners here, you've been working away, building a track record on something that's suddenly a hot and topical issue that everybody is talking about. Really interested in how you think we can use that moment well.
Yeah, thanks, Cinder. Yeah, I'm Shaheen, Director of Projects at Sporting Equals, and Sporting Equals have been working in this space around sport and cohesion and integration for a very long time. We've probably done more slightly smaller scale projects, and like Hannah said, we're privileged to be part of this toolkit and we've been quite involved. The toolkit is a good starting point for looking at how we can sort of measure sport beyond just the participation and looking at that wider social impact, particularly in light of the challenges out there and some of the issues that are sort of happening in terms of integration and creating that sense of sort of belonging. We started off with the Making Equals model, but we've also been running the Breaking Boundaries project, which is funded by Spirit 2012 and working in partnership with Youth Sport Trust. And this project is happening in 5 of the cities. Now, when we launched that project, it was probably at the very similar time that this toolkit was being developed. So the indicators in the toolkit are very similar to how we do in the M&E across the Breaking Boundaries project. And, you know, it's important we start looking at that broader social impact around sport and how we can live in a more cohesive society, because it's important that we can all get along. You know, there's a lot of, as a society, we're becoming more diverse, but we're also becoming more divided. And there's sort of a lot of groups that are facing a lot of disadvantage and inequalities compared to all others. And I think sport can provide a very powerful role in make such a big difference in terms of bridging that difference and creating a space where everyone feels as if they fit in, creating space where people feel like they belong, so they can walk into a sports club, for example, and feel as if they're going to be welcome, they're going to feel part of something as part of that sense of sort of belonging. So I think this is quite timely in terms of what is happening in that external environment. There's a lot of learning and there's a lot of expertise that has gone into this Toolkit resource, and I see it as probably a platform for all sports organisations to start thinking about how can we have that wider social impact and use this as a stepping stone so we can make that wider sector level change.
Great, thank you very much. So over to you, audience, quite soon with your questions, and we've got a couple that I can put to the panel, but do please get some more in. One thing I just want to ask a question of myself, Vivian, to you first, perhaps, about the nature of the challenge and opportunity that we face. And I think we've heard a lot about bridging as well as bonding, and you know why that's important. Different sports are in different places in terms of the types of engagement they've got, the types of barriers they want to cross, who's already there, who's not there, and how that works. I just wonder if you think sports have been thinking differently about connection and social connection and bridging, and is that different to sort of outreach and bringing people in who haven't been there? Those are obviously connected, but how do you see we can think about both of them more? Is there a risk that we get reach sometimes by engaging minorities in minority support and therefore not doing cohesion and integration?
It's a really interesting question, actually, Sunday. I think the pandemic has shown us that we can do things differently as communities without, and not necessarily around sport, but just thinking about people per se and how we treat and think and support people in general. And I think with sport, bringing the sport into it, we have the opportunity not just to bring different communities together, but to bring them around a purpose, so to coalesce around a purpose. And the sport might be the event, but there might be other factors around that. And we saw a lot through our Together Fund, which was happening in Inequalities Fund when we initially went out emergency through COVID, that it was around food and connecting people and allowing people not to feel alone. And the line of sight to sport was a bit further down the road, but it was more than just, you know, culturally diverse communities, it's more than gender communities. It was just generally about doing the right thing for people in general, which was great to see, the human race, you know, looking after each other in a way that it hadn't done so before. And I think that what we have to do now is really capitalise on that kind of momentum, that opportunity to do it as part of every day, to kind of move us back to, in fact, this is how we should be doing what we're doing. And sport and physical activity allows us so many more benefits in terms of our well-being and health. But if we kind of start to think about the bigger picture here, you know, we've got so much we can do together as communities. And then within that, absolutely, of different communities have different requirements and different needs and face different barriers. And we just have to look at those slightly differently now with community cohesion and integration in mind.
And did anyone else want to come in on this question of sort of the different kinds of divides that we have to cross: equality, diversity, inclusion, what the intentionality is about? Anybody else want to chip in from the panel?
Yeah, could I just chip in? And I think, you know, whilst we've all talked about intentionality, I think there's something about approaching that from a very asset-based perspective and not bringing people together and immediately saying we've brought you together because there's a problem that we now need to address. Actually, sport is meant to be fun. I mean, lots of people don't find it fun, but it's meant to be fun, it's meant to be cohesive. So in the background, there needs to be that intentionality and that purpose, and certainly for breaking boundaries that Shaheen has talked about, there's a lot of development work that goes on with the young people to make sure that that's built into the programme. But I think we need to be careful about intentionality leading us to a kind of deficit model around cohesion and integration that could, I think, really endanger delivering the social outcomes of the projects.
That's really helpful insight. I mean, that is certainly what the meaningful contact literature tells us, that saying come together because you don't like each other isn't always the frame that makes people think that's going to work or be conditions of equality. Now, Ruth's mentioned there, very good link to a question I've got, that lots of people like sport and some people are not sure or ambivalent about it, or have perceptions about it. And we do have a question from Jill Rutter, former colleague of mine, announced Spirits 2012. Sport England's Active Lives survey shows that 3/4 of women and almost 7 out of 10 of the overall adult population don't find sport enjoyable and satisfying. How do those involved in grassroots sports and physical activity address those perceptions, hesitancies, and so on in the context of social cohesion? Who's got an answer to that very big question? Hannah, you must face this challenge.
Yes, I mean, obviously Street Games mainly focuses on young people, but the stats won't be hugely different. Unfortunately, there are lots of young people who don't find sport enjoyable and satisfying. I think in this context, as in really any grassroots community sport type context, it's about understanding what those people do enjoy, what they would find satisfying, and then focusing there to start with. So quite often we'll find community groups will introduce sport by stealth. You don't have to advertise a football session, because actually what you'll mainly get is probably people who already love football and already play football. So how do you advertise a session which is about coming together, might be about something entirely different, what's going on in that community that might bring people together, that they might have an interest in, and then maybe you get them taking part in some kinds of physical activity as you progress, and that they feel in control of. But it's not easy work. I mean, that is why these community groups exist. That's why so many people work in this sector, because doing that is hard. But I think starting with what is of interest to the audience, and as was mentioned in that video earlier, understanding your audience and seeing what's happening in your local area. And then, sport by stealth, I suppose, is one of the things our community groups do quite a lot, where you might build up to different types of sporting activities. And also core to what we do and what we promote is offering a range. So actually, single sports sessions are often not appealing. So how do you offer a range of different types of activities that allow people to take part in a place that they feel safe, in a way that feels comfortable for them, and at a level that they feel, not embarrassed by. Sport is very challenging and embarrassing. I'm relatively sporty, and if I have to change gyms and join a new gym, I'm mortified. I don't want to walk through that place looking like I don't know where the equipment is, not knowing where the changing rooms are. So if we put all of that into context and assume that everybody arrives feeling nervous, how do you design something that starts with that point?
Great. And Vivian, you've spent a lot of time obviously looking at those barriers and getting insights. What are your insights and recommendations to other practitioners about what to do about them?
Yeah, thank you. I think the fact you talk about 75%, I think I would always encourage anybody who sees a stat like that, and including ourselves, to understand why that is. And I'd want to go directly to the women that feel that and have that conversation as to what is it that makes it not enjoyable, and what can we do. And it's about women or individuals who feel that they're not able to be involved or included, designing that approach that allows them to feel as if they can at least start the conversation. But starting the conversation is key. Understanding what the challenges and barriers are is additional to that. And then we then have to think about who is best placed to create the opportunity so it becomes enjoyable, so you can actually go on and tell others about how much you've enjoyed it and what your steps have been to change your perceptions. Actually now I'm happy to talk about it, actually now I'm happy to engage in it, now actually I'm part of a group or I'm part of a process. So there's steps that it takes, there's a few steps that needs to happen before all of that, but actually asking those who were affected by it directly, because they're the ones that can tell you. We can sit in a dark room and guess, but actually speaking to people, engaging them, will give you the response that you want. And it's for us as practitioners, it's for us, for policymakers, it's us for funders to then act on that. What's the point in doing all of that if you then don't act on it? So everything we're trying to do is in response to the data, what is telling us, the stories that are out there, the lived experiences, and trying to create solutions around that, not from us, but from our partners and from those that actually work in those communities to do that for us.
Thank you. Very practical, common sense response. Jo.
We talked a lot about this actually in terms of the development of the toolkit, and a section of the toolkit looks at conditions, and within that we talked a lot about workforce and workforce development. And I do think that if people see people like them who are leading activities and part of activities and encouraging them to get involved in activities, then in some ways you start to remove some of those barriers. So I mean, I absolutely agree with Vivian in terms of listening, but I think there's also something about workforce development and understanding that you need a range of role models, and that range of role models will then be that bridge into supporting some of those groups that don't traditionally engage in sports activities into sport. You know, I was just thinking about what Hannah was saying about walking into a gym. If you walk in as a middle-aged woman, if you walk into a gym as a middle-aged woman, you don't necessarily are going to feel that welcome, partly because of who the group of people that are around you, often younger, you know, often male, often, you know, kind of doing a lot of serious lifting. So it's I think that thing around workforce development and having role models and trying to kind of help people bridge into sport is really important.
Thanks. Another question we've got from Steve Harkner. Did the academic and literature review of this toolkit look at international experience? There are, he says, a lot of great examples of sport for social cohesion in Sri Lanka, in Latin America, in post-conflict and divided societies. Ollie, that's very much one you can offer us some insight into, and maybe I'll go to Kaya as well when we've heard from Ollie about international lessons and experiences.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Steve, for the question. There's probably two angles to reflect on the opportunities for learning from what is some well-developed theories of change, lived experience, practice within a range of contexts internationally. And one is coming back to the context, that actually that's got to be key, and the place, the area, the context is absolutely essential. And that's probably the important and the critical start point of the toolkit, is starting with the place, the context, the assets in that place, to take an asset-based approach. That said, I certainly agree with Steve. There's some well-developed methodologies, understanding, learning, iterative learning from using sport in some very complex environments and very complex contexts in a range of countries and a range of areas. And one thing that struck me probably for the last year or so, working much more intensively in the UK context, is there is an opportunity for those that are working to use sport as a tool to support social cohesion, that are working to use sport intentionally with an asset-based approach to deliver outcomes, to probably engage more with what is a international community of practitioners, of policymakers, of academics, and really share some of the learning. And in particular, the learning from, and it's a clunky term and I apologise for using it, but the learning from the global south into the global north, from the majority world to the minority world. And I think there's a significant amount that can be taken from some well-developed, locally led projects and programs in these diverse contexts that we could certainly benefit from in a UK context. And I hand to Kaya around the breadth of the research and the academic analysis. But if we've learned nothing else in the last 18 months, is that we are very interconnected globally. And so that opportunity to share and learn, and not with the assumptions that potentially one context or community has the sort of position of the knowledge and understanding. So I think it's a really valuable question and one that's worth reflecting on in this discussion.
Thanks. Kaya.
Thanks very much, Ollie. Yeah, I think what we did with what we've wanted to do with the tool is really learn from place-based approaches to sport and social cohesion. And so the research for this tool has been wide-ranging and has it's very robust and wide-ranging, and has drawn on international perspectives and global perspectives. So if you look at the guidance document that I'll ask my colleague Alex, who's working behind the scenes, to kind of link in the chat function, you'll see lots of different examples from lots of different places of what has worked and what hasn't worked so well in cohesion and integration and sports-related activities. So I think, yeah, we've been really keen to kind of learn from lots of different areas, and going forwards with our community of practice, I think this is something that we'll be really keen to do further. So to draw on different place-based approaches to cohesion and integration, and to think about what has worked and what hasn't worked so well. And Joe may want to say a little bit about that as well.
Joe? Okay? No, you're okay. Just another question we've got, and Shaheen, your thoughts will be excellent on this. MS is the question. I don't have the full name, but how would you tackle sports groups coming together who are of one single ethnicity, who then might compete with groups of another single ethnicity? At one level, they are mixing. Yet, are they mixing, or are they not mixing? Can and should we encourage more mixed and diverse ethnicity sports groups? What would your perspective be on that question, Shaheen?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities out there, and I think we need to be working through grassroots community-based organisations. As I mentioned before, my introductory, Breaking Boundaries is pioneering the way. You could probably see that as a blueprint, where we're trying to get in one ward, you will probably get one organisation on the same street as another that have never spoken to each other before. And what we need to do as a, whether it's a local club or a sports organisation, to look at, okay, who are we actually engaging, and how do we widen our offer to try and bring in people that are not engaging and might feel they've got barriers, and maybe look at the toolkit to look at the equalisers. Are we, for example, integrating the women and girls? If not, does there need to be, does that offer need to be slightly adjusted, or can we work with the community group in that local area to try and get that engagement from women and girls, if that's where we feel there's the gap? So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. There's a lot of organisations working at that grassroots level that have the expertise and insight that a lot of, I think, the sport providers don't have. We have to look at local areas, we have to look at what provision exists, and then we need to look at the demographic profiles. Who are we engaging? Who do we need to bring together? Are there wider social issues? I think we can't work as a sector in isolation. We have to work with the cohesion teams, we have to work with sport development teams, we have to work with the neighbourhood teams. That's when we can affect that bigger social change in local areas, because by integrating services and sharing learning and sharing best practice and sharing resources, we can make a huge difference in areas. Because at the moment, what's happening, we tend to be working in quite silos. Sport is in its own box, education is its own box, facilities is sort of in its own box. Clubs just tend to, okay, that's our membership, we're quite happy and comfortable with that. I think we need to start stepping outside our comfort zones and start thinking beyond the box, because as a society, we need to try and bring that cohesiveness across the piece. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is these joined up approaches. So, you know, we need to start thinking differently.
Thanks. And I think the question, and obviously the balance to be struck in all sorts of directions, this question I think is a much more prominent one now as people reflect on the experience of cricket in Yorkshire, which I think is a place where there was obviously a shared love of the game, very high participation, yet instead of bridging the divides that there were undoubtedly in Yorkshire in the last 30, 40, 50 years, in a way sport replicated those divides, even though it had very high participation. Lots of other sports will have different and distinct challenges. Vivine, when Shane talks about, you know, taking things out of silos, in lots of ways sport and other societies, I mean, each sport must think of itself as very unique and different, which is always true, of course. How have you found the opportunities to work across sports in that respect?
I think it's a great question, and thanks, Shaheen. I think that, you know, the reason that sometimes we have what we call parallel structures is because people have not felt able to, Shaheen's identified, not felt able to engage with what we call mainstream structures or the general sport. There's something missing that's made them not feel welcome, as you referred to, safe. And that's sad, but at the same time, what you see, and you have to then hold that thought and think, okay, well, actually, as a result of that, people are finding a space where they can engage and feel safe, enjoy the sport, if it brings the same benefits and successes and opportunities as mainstream. So we've got to find a way to get the two to kind of work with each other, really talk to each other and understand, how do we change the current system so it's much more inclusive? My favourite word of all time is inclusion. You know, if we're not including, what are we doing? Then we're excluding. And so for me, how do we then make it inclusive? How do we make the two kind of set of structures speak to each other so that everyone gets a better experience, and we can make the changes in the workforce, we make the changes in the offer, we can make the changes in the way we implement and put sport out there, but also allow people to grow and to grow within the sport, grow within the physical activity without feeling that I have to be with, for me, I have to be with black women to do it, because if I don't, then I can't enjoy it. Well, that's not always possible. So I want to be able to do that in a place wherever I can. So I can go off my lived experience and understand that. And we have to listen to that lived experience and respond to it in a way that people feel that they're genuinely being listened to, but they also feel that they've now been included in sport, physical activity, which they feel is for them.
And what one opportunity, and Hannah, I'd like your view on this. One opportunity is that as we think across the decades and across the generations, there's definitely more social contact and less social distance between people of different groups that are younger, certainly up to a point, but obviously there's still work to do, and that's different in different places, different social classes, different educational experiences, and so on. I just wondered, Hannah, your reflections on whether the shape of this challenge is changing, or what your experience is of how you engage with it.
Yeah, you're right that social distance is a great phrase at the moment, full stop, isn't it, in terms of where we are. But I thought the question about how to bring teams together that might be coming from different ethnic backgrounds, etc., was a really interesting one. Firstly, I suppose that for me, one of the practical things that Vivine mentioned really early on is food. You can't go wrong ever with introducing food to any situation. And I do think there are some really practical things you can do around food, around social opportunities, around including families in sporting events or leagues that increase the safety, the inclusion element of it, and allow people to interact away from a competition. But to your wider point, Cinder, one of the things we've most recently found working with young people is the sense of extreme polar opinions is so embedded now in a way that I don't think we were finding 10 years ago when I first joined Street Games about 11 years ago in our youth facing work, and we did a piece this year around youth voice and around how young people find a voice in the system and feel heard. And actually one of the elements we had to add to our work with those young people this year was training around how it's okay to disagree with someone, because that they're growing up and they're experiencing a world now, especially on social media, but in lots of media places and also in the playground, unfortunately, where disagreeing means the end of a conversation, you know, that actually somebody who says something wrong, you know, is removed from a conversation rather than being brought into it, and rather than having the opportunity to further learn and explore what's happening. So we did a whole piece of training, which, you know, would not have existed, I don't think, 10 years ago, about how to disagree well, how to be okay at the end of a constructive discussion. And I think that's the type of thing we're going to see that needs to be more embedded into our work now, that not only are we providing this kind of sense of psychological safety, but particularly around the idea that you can play next to, sit next to, exist next to somebody who you don't agree with, but you can find a way of working together anyway. And that's a big shift that's become much more marked from our experience.
That's very interesting, Hannah, because we think about that a lot in sort of politics and debates about free speech. It can come into sport. Sport might help us with some of that perspective taking. Very practical question from Mahbub of Good Deeds, which is well directed, I think, at maybe at Belong and the direction of the toolkit. He says, we attempt to offer a variety of sports to allow young people to seek their potential. Mainly, we use volunteers to help deliver these. There isn't much available to develop, train up skilled volunteers staff to be properly equipped. What advice do you offer a small grassroots organisation, please? Maybe that's one for you, Jo.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that, actually, and it's something that we've been thinking about a lot at Belong. We don't necessarily have an immediate answer to it, but we have been thinking about the issue of volunteering and social cohesion more broadly. I think partly because of the findings in our research report, which show that areas that have invested in social cohesion have volunteering rates twice as high as elsewhere. So we think there's a really interesting relationship between volunteering and social cohesion, but that we need to understand more about it, and we need to understand more about how we can support volunteering, which also promotes social cohesion. So I think that some of the learning in the toolkit, so what I mean, one of the things that we thought about a lot when we were developing the toolkit is that actually, although the toolkit is specifically designed for sports and physical activity, a lot of the kind of core principles in the toolkit apply across the board. They could apply to, you know, an arts program, a cultural program, and a volunteering program. So I think I would sort of start with the toolkit and working through that and thinking, you know, about how to work with volunteers through answering some of those questions that are in the toolkit. But I do also think there is a bigger piece of work to do around volunteering and social cohesion and how we can support it better. And I'm also aware that Ruth has just launched, Spirit has just launched a big commission on volunteering, so she might also want to.
I'd love to hear from Ruth on this. I think there's a big challenge as well around this specific area about volunteers, equipping volunteers, supporting volunteers across all fronts, but in sport. This is an urgent moment, and, you know, sporting governing bodies say, we're sorry we didn't do well enough, we will try harder, you know, it hasn't happened. If you've then dedicated your life to the athletics club, the cricket club, and so on, you might be hearing, you know, you failed, you didn't do enough, you know, get out of the way or something. Ruth, what do we need to do with volunteers in this challenge?
I think there's a very urgent piece of action around continued development for volunteers and really developing a workforce. Several people have already said it, that looks like the people that are attending the sports sessions or physical activity sessions. I think we need to really broaden out the way we look at projects to encompass all of the things we've talked about, particularly volunteering, particularly workforce development, how we engage families who are often volunteers but don't necessarily call themselves volunteers, how peers and participants become volunteers by stealth. There's two things I would add. We've done a big piece of work with the Activity Alliance called Get Out, Get Active, which is particularly looking at how you can bring disabled and non-disabled people together through sport and physical activity. That's also part funded by Sport England. And they've done lots of work on how volunteers can be supported to support disabled people to participate. And that tends not to be traditional sports club volunteers actually, but people in the community who are coming together to support their peers, friends, family. And so we need to think about how they benefit from some of the the good investment we give to volunteers in a more formal structure. The inquiry that Joe mentioned isn't strictly about volunteering. The first part of it was about volunteering. It's about how events can catalyse change in communities. A big part of that I don't think we've grasped yet is about volunteers. Next year, we'll see tens of thousands of volunteers trained to take part in sports activities, to take part in the Jubilee, in communities, how we seize that opportunity and make sure those volunteers can be deployed then for really good community work is a challenge for all of us, I think.
Great, thanks. Hannah.
Yeah, I suppose just a couple of practical things. So, Mabab, I think you were training with one of my colleagues on Friday, so apologies if this is a repeat of things you've heard, but to all organisations, I suppose it's back to what Shaheen said earlier about local links. So, have you contacted Yorkshire Sport and in particular Leeds Sport? There's a programme from the Chartered Institute, which is called Retrain to Retain, which is really focused on the communities that we're talking about. So reaching out into those networks and looking for training. But I think to the broader point, which Ruth was touching on there, is those organisations that provide training, and I include ourselves in this, have to then understand the communities and the volunteers and the staff who are working. You can't provide training at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. You know, that training needs to be designed to be flexible, to be in those communities, you know, easy to get to, as free or cheap as you can possibly make it, because actually training is a demand, it's an extra demand on volunteers. So if we don't make it, you know, as cheap as we possibly can, we don't make it as flexible as we possibly can, we're just adding an additional barrier. And I think certainly, mainstream sporting organisations, we don't always do that. We don't always live that inclusion element of training. So do push back if you find training that isn't accessible, you know, let us know that.
And Shaheen, from a Sporting Equals perspective, have you experienced this point of when people hear that their sport needs to be more inclusive, they can feel a bit anxious about how they're going to be part of that, how they're going to manage to do it?
Yeah, I think at the moment there's a lot of pressure on resources. Sporting Equals are doing some grant distribution through the Sporting and Tackling Inequalities, and also we give out some emergency COVID-19 funding through Comic Relief. And it was quite interesting to see the analysis in terms of the applications that were coming on the system. There's a lot of, because of the external environment, a lot of pressure on resources, volunteers, people losing venues, people losing membership fees. So there's a big squeeze on the voluntary sector at the moment. And I think that's having an impact. And I think my advice would be any project needs to really think about how we can create more infrastructure capacity support to support volunteers, to support training, to support pathways into employment, even upskilling volunteers to allow to bring that capacity into the sector, because otherwise what we're finding is a lot of these grassroots community organisations are really struggling in the current environment. Some of them we've lost them because of the external environment, and I think there needs to be a recognition there. Whatever investment is going in, there needs to be that capacity support plugged in to allow us to grow those community organisations working at that grassroots level. What we're doing through the grant distribution is just touching the surface. There's a real struggle out there, so we need to, as part of that, we need to look at our volunteer infrastructure and look, are we actually even getting the diversity within volunteering? If it's not, then you need to be connecting to the community grassroots clubs that are outside there, because we are finding through all the Sporting Equals project there's a keen interest. There's a lot of young people that want to get into sport, want to get into volunteering, but unfortunately the way the sector is set up, they're either not getting opportunities, or because there's pressure on resources, they're not getting, you know, the employed staff within the organisations haven't got sometimes the capacity to support that volunteer, because when you bring in a volunteer, you have to give them a good experience, yet they have to be supported and managed. But the problem at the moment is we're getting squeezed to the point that it can be quite challenging, because it's quite difficult times out there.
Thank you. We're coming close to time. I'd just like to give each of the panelists the chance just to give me a 30-second sort of final thought. We had other good contributions that I didn't get to use as questions that included equipping people to understand the barriers. You know, confidence of women came up from some people. Childcare being a barrier. Somebody who's talking about martial arts and its value for self-defense says that they find childcare as of real value to access. Another point was the role of universities. Have we got good examples of that? But without all of you answering those questions, can I just ask each of you just for your sort of final takeaway thought before I wrap things up in a minute? Ollie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, final takeaway thought is really that reflection on what are the sort of results or outcomes that we want to see based on the interventions, and so the importance of that monitoring and evaluation, probably valuable as we get to the end of the discussion. And circling back to the toolkit, there's a lot of coherence between some of the approaches, tools, indicators that are put forward in that toolkit. Some of the stuff Shaheen's spoken about. There's about 50 organisations in the Sport for Development Coalition who are using similar indicators, and critically, they draw from outside of sport. They draw from understanding society, from the community life survey. So really valuable to understand how sport-based approaches compare with actually what's happening in communities. And I'll give you an example from the coalition data. There's about 59% of people who understand society survey, so they feel like they belong to their neighbourhood. The collection of Sport for Development organisations using similar indicators is up into the mid 60%. So final thought is really that thought process on what are the outcomes we want to achieve, and really understand the efficacy of the approaches that we're utilising through sport to support social cohesion.
Thanks, Ollie. Hannah.
I think mine's probably a practical point, which is, I suppose I'm always pulling back to, is lots of what we've heard today is about that idea of how you deliver more effectively. And I think social cohesion is absolutely something that can't be delivered well by a standalone organisation. So do think about those other organisations in your local area that might have completely different purposes to you. So, you know, things about barriers to women is a great example of that. You know, go and find a mums group, because they might be desperately trying to introduce sport and you're desperately trying to find mums. And how do you, you know, make those connections? Because the cohesion element that you'll find possible actually needs to start with your ability to work with other organisations and your approach to cohesion in that sense.
Thanks. Shaheen.
Yeah, collaborations, working in partnerships, particularly with grassroots community organisations at a local level, understanding there's a lot of those organisations will have a lot of local intel, which can really help support and really sort of ensure that offers are pitched at the right level, whether it's for women and girls or you know, whatever or even the sport, what are local people sort of interested in, and then use it toolkit as a like an indicator. You don't necessarily need to measure against every single one. What I'd say is keep it very, very simple, because I mean the communities we're working with have we sometimes grapple with language literacy, data protection. People don't want to give their age, so it's working with communities to find easy ways of collecting data alongside what we're sort of trying to do. So keep it simple. Thanks.
Thanks, Ruth.
So I think I'd reinforce what everybody said, because it's all great, but particularly I think for me it's about the approach over the activity, and how we can take an approach that encompasses sport and, you know, kind of have a bit of a tussle with the word sport, so physical activity from soup to nuts, so that it all leads towards cohesion outcomes. So how do you bring food in, like Vivine says? How do you bring the family along? How do you construct an approach to what you're doing that that brings people together in that positive way, rather than focusing on, is it going to be Zumba, is it going to be cricket, how do we, and that starts from really knowing your community and knowing who's in the room, who isn't in the room, and how you deliver those outcomes. So I think the toolkit is going to be a really, really powerful way of helping organisations think that through.
Thanks. Kaya.
Thank you. Yeah, I think just echoing what everybody else has said, I mean, I think the discussion today has really highlighted the importance of understanding your area, understanding the context that you're operating in, and understanding the people that you want to kind of attend your sports program or activity. And I think that what we've really tried to do with the toolkit is guide you through a process that will help you to do those things. And so I would really urge you to just have a look at the toolkit, see if it will be of value to you. And I really hope that it will be. And please do feedback, tell us your thoughts and reflections on the toolkit, because we would love to hear them.
Thanks. Vivian.
Thank you. I think all of the above, because it would be silly of me to repeat them all. But I think for me, it's, you know, the toolkit is there to help you. And I would encourage you to understand what you want to do first before going on to the tool, because that will enable you to get the right outcome. So I would say engage. Listen to the lived experiences of people telling you exactly what they want, and take action and respond to that in a positive way, and then use the toolkit to design and develop the outcomes that you really want to make, you want to highlight that will make a difference to sport and physical activity for people who are not necessarily engaged, or we can help to integrate and create communities where people feel that they belong and they feel safe.
Thanks. And Jo.
I guess my advice would be very practical, which is actually sort of trust the toolkit, because a huge amount of work and effort and good thought and intentionality, to use one of Ollie's words, has gone into it. So I would say trust it, but I also think echo much of what other people have said. But it really is about making connections at so many different levels. You know, it is about really knowing your local area and making the connections there, and seeing sport as something that is embedded into people's lives rather than it's the thing that you do. You know, seeing it as part of that much more holistic, bigger picture of how people live in their communities and how people lead their lives, and the potential for sport to really be transformative in terms of bringing people together into sort of, you know, fantastic interactions which help reduce prejudice and promote empathy. I think sport's got huge potential to do that if we have the intentionality and handle it in the right way.
Thank you, Jo. Now, I know Belong will have the intentionality of continuing this conversation with many of you, which is going to be really important. Just a couple of reflections on everything we've been hearing this morning. I think this toolkit clearly fills an important gap, and people are going to find it very useful for lots of different reasons we've been hearing. The fact that it fills a gap tells us something, I think, which is that for all that we talk a lot about sport in this country, you know, which can be quite sports mad in lots of ways, we have actually undervalued it, I think, for social connection and social cohesion, because they're the games we play that we enjoy. We haven't entirely understood its value. I think partly for cultural reasons, perhaps, you know, in a way, sort of arts and culture have a particular type of status, and that sport is sometimes overlooked by people who see arts and culture, which is very important as well. And heritage, these are great ways to do reach, but sport is really there all the time as a chance. And we've undervalued social connection in sport and bridging. And if we don't have the intentionality we've been talking about, we'll often get the bonding, and that will be good in the way that it's good. But then sport can also replicate the problems if we don't make sure we've got the bonding and the bridging, and that's where you need strategies and to think through the challenges. So we've got two opportunities, I think, as practitioners, thinkers, people in this space. One is we've got more opportunities to tell the story about why it matters, keep the salience up, make sure people don't forget it's a watershed moment, make sure people don't forget about everything that they've said about the need for change. And that's going to be really important around those high profile moments. But we're really going to need, I think, the community of practice that Belong have talked about to link up more across places, across sports, across different challenges, what people's going on, because we probably don't know as much as we should about what does work and what sounds good but actually doesn't work when you try it. And therefore, if someone's found that out in Manchester, maybe people could know about that in Birmingham. I think there's a lot of practical sharing at that level, as well as the stories we tell ourselves about when we get sport right, wrong. So it's been brilliant that Belong have done this. Well done to everyone who's done the work on the panel and elsewhere. Thank you for all of the practitioner insights that we've had, and we'll hear from Joe and Belong how the conversation carries on. But I think there's a real opportunity in this moment. The headlines will move on and the work will go on. And so it's great that all of you are doing this. Thanks very much for all the work you're doing, and thanks for taking part this morning. Thank you.